January 17, 1945. East Prussia. The hand of Senior Sergeant Ivan Kovalev trembled as he wrote in his hidden notebook words that could earn him 20 years in the Gulag if discovered by the NKVD officers watching his unit. They lied to us about everything. He had just entered his first German farmhouse. What he found there would shatter 2 decades of Soviet propaganda in a single afternoon. And he wasn't alone. Over the next 6 months, 6.5 million Soviet soldiers would pour into Central Europe. And what they discovered would plant the seeds of the USSR's eventual collapse, 46 years later. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the magnitude of what these men saw, you first need to understand what they believed. The world, according to Stalin, the Soviet soldier of 1945, had been raised on absolute certainty. Capitalism was dying. The West was collapsing. Workers in America and Europe lived in desperate squalor, while Soviet citizens built paradise on Earth. This wasn't propaganda, it was simply reality, repeated in every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every school lesson since childhood. Senior Sergeant Ivan Kovalev was 26 years old. He had never left his village of Novokuznetsk until conscription. His entire understanding of the outside world came from Pravda, from his political officers' lectures, from the posters showing emaciated American workers begging for bread, while Soviet farmers smiled beneath abundant harvests. He believed it completely. Why wouldn't he? His unit, the 301st Rifle Division of the First Belarusian Front, had fought from Stalingrad to Poland. They had seen German brutality firsthand. They had liberated death camps. They knew the Nazis were evil. And they had been told, repeatedly, that ordinary Germans were starving slaves of capitalism, desperate for Soviet liberation. On January 16, 1945, they crossed into East Prussia. What they found on January 17th would change everything. The first farmhouse, the house stood intact, miraculously untouched by the artillery barrage that had preceded the Soviet advance. Kovalev's squad approached cautiously, expecting resistance. Instead, they found it abandoned. The family fled just hours before. What happened next is documented in Kovalev's diary. Confiscated by the KGB in 1951 but preserved in their archives, declassified only in 1993. We entered through the kitchen door. Mikhail stopped so suddenly I walked into him. He was staring at the table. There was food, real food. White bread, not black. Butter, cheese, smoked ham hanging from the ceiling. Jars of preserved fruit covering an entire shelf. Mikhail began to cry. He said, "Ivan, my children haven't seen food like this since before the war. These are supposed to be the starving workers we came to save, but it got worse. Or better, or more confusing." Kovalev's writing becomes almost incoherent as he struggles to process what he's seeing. The house had electric lights in every room, not just one bulb hanging from the ceiling like the collective farm administrator's office back home, but multiple lights, switches on the walls, lamps on tables. The electrical wiring was neat, professional, complete. There was a bathroom inside the house with running water, hot and cold, a porcelain toilet that flushed, a bathtub with taps. Kovalev, who had never in his life seen indoor plumbing, turned the tap and watched clean water flow. He wrote, "I didn't understand. Where did the water come from? Where did it go?" This was a farmer's house, not a palace. In the bedroom, they found closets full of clothes. Not one good suit for church and work clothes, but multiple outfits. The wife had 7 dresses. 7. Kovalev's mother owned 1 dress, carefully mended and remended, worn on holidays. There was a radio in the living room, a mechanical clock that chimed, books, dozens of books on shelves, photographs in frames showing the family on vacation at the beach. Vacation. The concept seemed alien. Private Dmitry Ivanov found the children's room. 2 beds, 1 for each child. Toys scattered on the floor, wooden trains, dolls with porcelain faces, building blocks. He picked up a stuffed bear and sat on the bed, holding it, silent tears running down his face. His 3 children back in Kursk shared 1 straw mattress. But the kitchen is what broke them. When they opened the pantry, they found shelves stocked with enough food to feed their entire platoon for a week. Flour in large sacks. Sugar, real white sugar, not the brown crystals occasionally distributed in Soviet rations. Tins of meat. Jars of honey. Bags of real coffee. Sergeant Mikhail Volkov wrote in a letter to his wife, intercepted by military censors, "Nina, I don't know how to tell you this. The farmer whose house I am writing from, he ate better than our general. His children had more food than our officers. And this was just one house, an ordinary house. They told us Germans were starving. They told us capitalism had failed. Nina, what else did they lie about? The letter never reached her. Volkov was arrested by the NKVD 2 weeks later for anti-Soviet agitation. He would spend 8 years in Kolyma, but you couldn't arrest everyone. And what the soldiers were seeing couldn't be unseen. The spreading realization as the Soviet advance continued, the evidence mounted. Each town revealed the same pattern. Each farmhouse told the same story. The German standard of living even for ordinary workers and farmers exceeded anything most Soviet soldiers had experienced. Lieutenant Vasily Grovensky, a decorated tank commander, entered the town of Allenstein with the 2nd Guards Tank Army. His diary entry from January 23, 1945, the town was mostly intact. We expected ruins, poverty, the collapsed capitalism our political officers described. Instead, I saw paved streets in even the smallest neighborhoods. Electric streetlights on every corner. They must have had power generation we can't imagine. Shop windows still displayed goods our people haven't seen in years. Leather shoes, wool coats, children's toys. We entered a workers' apartment building. I know it was for workers because we found employment papers from the local brick factory. The apartments had 3 rooms each. 3 rooms for factory workers. My parents shared one room with 6 people in Moscow. Each apartment had a small bathroom, electric heating, kitchen with a gas stove. The worker's wife had a sewing machine, a real Singer sewing machine, like only the wives of party officials have back home. Grovensky goes on, but here's what I cannot explain to you, dear diary, because I don't understand it myself. We found photographs of this worker and his family on vacation. They had traveled to Munich, to the mountains, on holiday. A factory worker, on vacation, with photographs to prove it. They owned a camera. The cognitive dissonance was literally making soldiers sick. Field hospitals reported increasing cases of what doctors called confusion states, men who seemed physically fine, but couldn't stop talking about the houses they'd seen, the bathrooms, the food, asking the same questions over and over. How? Why? What did they tell us? Political officers worked overtime trying to explain. This is stolen wealth, plundered from conquered peoples. This is why we must destroy fascism. But the soldiers could do arithmetic. Germany had been at war for 5 years. The Soviet Union had been building socialism for 27 years. If Germany could plunder this wealth in 5 years of war, what did that say about 27 years of socialism? Private Anatoly Rybakov wrote in a letter that somehow escaped censorship. They tell us this is stolen wealth, but where are the poor neighborhoods? Where are the slums our officers promised we'd see? We've passed through dozens of towns now. I haven't seen a single street that looks worse than the best streets in Moscow. Berlin, the final revelation, April 1945. The assault on Berlin. By the time Soviet forces entered the German capital, 1.5 million Soviet soldiers had already passed through occupied Germany. Rumors had spread despite NKVD surveillance. The political officers' explanations were wearing thin. Soldiers were writing home in coded language, trying to tell their families what they'd seen without saying it directly. But Berlin would remove all doubt. Major Alexander Kozlov, a career officer and party member since 1939, entered Berlin with the 8th Guards Army on April 21st. His faith in the system was unshakable. He had survived the purges. He had led men at Kursk. He believed in Stalin, in the party, in the socialist future. Then he entered an ordinary apartment building in the Charlottenburg district. His report to his commanding officer, found in military archives in 1994, Comrade General, I must report a severe morale problem. My men are discovering that German workers live better than our officers. I have personally inspected 15 residential buildings in our sector. All had indoor plumbing. All had electricity. All had gas heating. These were apartment buildings for ordinary workers, Comrade General. Not party officials, not factory directors, ordinary workers. I found a bicycle in nearly every apartment. I found radios. I found multiple sets of clothes. I found food stockpiles that would feed a Soviet family for months. Comrade General, how do I explain to men who fought from Stalingrad to Berlin that the enemy they defeated lived better than their own families? He couldn't explain it. Nobody could. Private Grigory Chukre, who would later become a famous Soviet film director, wrote in his memoirs, "We entered a working-class neighborhood in Berlin. The buildings had been damaged by shelling, but you could still see how people had lived. I walked into an apartment that had a bathroom with a bathtub, a kitchen with a gas stove and a refrigerator. A refrigerator. I had never seen one except in pictures. The family had fled, but their possessions remained. I opened the closet and counted 18 pairs of shoes. 18 pairs? I own one pair of boots. But the most devastating discovery was still to come. As Soviet forces secured the city, soldiers began exploring more thoroughly. They found department stores with entire floors of consumer goods, furniture stores displaying living room sets, appliance stores with washing machines and vacuum cleaners, bookstores with thousands of titles. Sergeant Ivan Konov wrote, "We found a store that sold only toys. Only toys, 3 floors. We stood there, battle-hardened soldiers who had killed hundreds of Germans, and we cried. We cried thinking about our children who have never owned a toy, who play with sticks and rocks. And this was the enemy we defeated. This was the dying capitalism we were supposed to be superior to." The bicycle incident, one story spread through the Soviet ranks like wildfire. Whispered in cigarette breaks, shared in hushed conversations when the political officers weren't listening. It became legendary, told and retold, because it captured everything in a single moment. Lieutenant Nikolai Vasilyev and his men were securing a residential district in Berlin. They entered an apartment building that had been abandoned by its residents. In the basement storage area, they found bicycles. Dozens of bicycles, each one labeled with an apartment number. This wasn't remarkable in itself, but then someone did the math. The building had 40 apartments. There were 37 bicycles in storage. Nearly every family had owned a bicycle. Vasilyev, a committed communist who had joined the party at age 18, sat down on the basement steps and put his head in his hands. One of his soldiers asked if he was all right. 37 bicycles, Vasilyev said, in one building. In my entire village of 600 people, there are 4 bicycles total, all owned by collective farm administrators. But here's what made the story spread. Vasilyev then ordered his men to take the bicycles, not for themselves, but to send home to their families in the Soviet Union. As they loaded the bicycles onto a truck, a soldier asked, "Comrade Lieutenant, are we liberating these people or robbing them?" Vasilyev couldn't answer. The question hung in the air. They were the victorious liberators of Europe, the soldiers of the workers' paradise. Why were they stealing bicycles from the workers they had supposedly saved from capitalist oppression? The loot and the questions. The looting of Germany by Soviet forces is well documented. Officially, it was reparations, and officially, it was millions of soldiers trying to bring home proof of what they'd seen, trying to give their families some piece of the prosperity they'd discovered in enemy territory. They took everything: bicycles, sewing machines, radios, watches. German watches became legendary in the USSR. Clothing, dishes, silverware, furniture when they could manage it, household goods of every description. But here's what the Soviet authorities didn't anticipate. Every item sent home was evidence. Every wristwatch was proof. Every bicycle was a question. Every sewing machine was an accusation. When Private Boris Slutsky sent home a woman's bicycle for his wife, he included a note. "This belonged to a factory worker's family in Berlin. I thought you should have one too." His wife wrote back, "Why does a German factory worker's wife have a bicycle when I don't?" It was a dangerous question. Thousands were asking it. Captain Lev Kopolev, a committed communist who had volunteered in 1941, began to see the systematic looting as something darker. In his memoirs, published decades later after his exile from the USSR, he wrote, "We were taking everything: watches from wrists, bicycles from sheds, food from pantries, and I began to realize we weren't liberators collecting just reparations. We were poor relatives looting the rich cousin's house. Everything we took was an admission that they had it and we didn't. That capitalism, despite all we'd been told, had produced a material abundance that socialism had not." The NKVD was watching. They knew morale was collapsing. They knew soldiers were asking questions. Special NKVD detachments began intercepting letters, censoring diaries, arresting the most vocal complainers. Between April and December 1945, over 13,000 Soviet soldiers were arrested for anti-Soviet agitation. Most of their crimes: talking too openly about what they'd seen in Germany, writing too honestly to families back home, asking why German workers lived better than Soviet officers. But you can't arrest everyone. 6.5 million Soviet soldiers passed through Central Europe. Millions saw the evidence with their own eyes. The contrast with the East, and then came the comparison that made everything worse. As Soviet forces occupied Eastern Germany and began moving into Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, soldiers could directly compare living standards in areas under German control versus areas that had been independent. Private Yuri Najibin wrote in his diary, We moved from Berlin into rural Poland. I expected Polish farms to look like ours, collective, organized, productive. Instead, I found farms that looked medieval. Wooden plows, no electricity, no machinery, houses with dirt floors. Then I understood. This is what we actually look like. This is the standard we actually achieved. Germany, even defeated Germany, is so far ahead it's like comparing different centuries. The same pattern repeated everywhere. Soviet soldiers saw that German-occupied territories had been modernized, roads built, electrical grids installed, industry developed. Meanwhile, the independent Eastern European nations looked, well, they looked like the Soviet Union. Lieutenant David Samoylov, a poet who would later become one of the USSR's most famous writers, wrote in a letter to his friend, Petya, "I've discovered something that horrifies me. We didn't defeat a dying capitalist state. We defeated a modern industrial power that, even while fighting a war on two fronts, maintained a standard of living higher than ours during peacetime. What does this mean for everything we believe? What does this mean for everything we've been told?" The letter was intercepted. Samoylov spent 3 months in military detention being re-educated. But he was lucky his status as a decorated officer saved him from the Gulag. Others weren't so fortunate. The Americans, a second shock for those Soviet soldiers who reached the Elbe River in April 1945. There was yet another revelation waiting: direct contact with American forces. The meeting of Soviet and American troops at Torgau on April 25, 1945, is famous for the photographs of soldiers embracing, celebrating together, allies in victory. What's less known is what Soviet soldiers saw when they encountered their American counterparts. Sergeant Vladimir Gelfand, whose diary was published posthumously in 2005, recorded his first meeting with American soldiers. "We heard them before we saw them, American jazz music playing from a radio in their camp. We approached cautiously, not knowing what to expect. What we found astounded us. Their camp was like a small city, tents ranged in neat rows, electric generators powering lights, a field kitchen that smelled like a restaurant. The soldiers were clean-shaven, their uniforms fresh. They looked like they'd just left a parade ground. One American soldier offered me chocolate, real chocolate. He pulled it from his pocket casually, like it was nothing. I tried to refuse, it was too valuable, but he just laughed and gave me 3 bars. 3? He said they were part of his rations, his daily rations. The American supplies shocked Soviet soldiers even more than German prosperity. The Americans had trucks, so many trucks that junior officers drove them. Soviet armies moved on foot and horse-drawn carts, even at this late stage of the war. The Americans had gasoline to spare. Soviet tanks often sat immobile for lack of fuel. American soldiers ate tinned meat, white bread, chocolate, and real coffee. Soviet soldiers ate black bread and thin soup, supplemented by whatever they could forage or loot. Junior Lieutenant Viktor Nekrasov wrote, "An American private lives better than our colonels. He has cigarettes, chocolate, tinned food. He has a watch, a real wristwatch, not stolen, issued by his army. He has extra uniforms. He has a sleeping bag that looks like it came from a luxury hotel." When I commented on all this, he shrugged and said it was normal. Normal. This level of material abundance was normal for them. But here's what really broke through. The Americans were friendly. They shared their supplies freely. They showed photographs of their homes, ordinary American homes with cars, refrigerators, telephones. They talked about their lives, factory workers, farmers, shop clerks, and described a prosperity that seemed impossible. Corporal Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the future Nobel Prize winner, had a conversation with an American sergeant that he would reference for the rest of his life. The American showed him pictures of his family home in Ohio, a white wooden house with a porch, 2 cars in the driveway, a refrigerator visible through the kitchen window. The American explained he was a mechanic in a factory before the war. His wife worked as a secretary. They owned their home. They owned their cars. They went on vacation every summer. Solzhenitsyn asked if his family was wealthy. The American looked confused. "No," he said. "We're regular people. This is just normal." In his memoir The Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn would write, "That conversation planted a seed of doubt. That grew until it consumed my entire worldview. If an American mechanic lived better than a Soviet general, what did that mean? If capitalism produced such abundance for ordinary people, what did that say about our system?" That conversation would eventually cost him 8 years in the Gulag. But he wasn't alone in his doubts. The return home between 1945 and 1948, Soviet soldiers returned home. They came back to us are devastated by war, 27 million dead, cities in ruins, factories destroyed, agriculture collapsed. They came back to the same communal apartments, the same food shortages, the same material poverty they'd left behind. But now they had seen something else. They had seen that another way was possible. The Soviet government understood the danger. A massive propaganda campaign was launched. The prosperity Soviet soldiers had witnessed was explained away. German wealth was stolen from conquered peoples. American abundance comes from exploitation of workers. Western materialism is spiritual poverty. Our hardship is temporary, we're building the future. For many soldiers, especially older ones deeply committed to the party, these explanations were enough. They had to be enough. The alternative, accepting that everything they'd fought for was based on lies, was too painful. But for younger soldiers, for those who had seen too much, the doubts persisted. Private Mikhail Gorbachev, who had served as a combine harvester operator on a collective farm before conscription, returned to his village in 1946. His father, a tractor driver, asked what he'd seen. "Papa," Gorbachev said carefully, knowing informers were everywhere. "German farmers had machines we don't have. They had electricity we don't have. They had prosperity we don't have. And they lost the war." His father was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Maybe the war was the only thing we're better at." That conversation, Gorbachev would later claim, planted the seeds of glasnost and perestroika, the reforms that would eventually destroy the USSR. The young soldier who saw German prosperity in 1945 would become the general secretary, who acknowledged Soviet failure in 1985. The culture of silence throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. Soviet veterans lived with a terrible secret. They knew the truth about the West. They had seen it, but they couldn't speak it. The punishment for anti-Soviet agitation was severe, typically 10 years in the Gulag. Even private conversations were dangerous. Family members informed on each other. Neighbors reported suspicious statements. The NKVD was everywhere. So veterans developed a coded language. They would tell their children, things are different in other places. They would carefully preserve looted items, watches, cameras, bicycles as silent testimony. They would share knowing glances when propaganda films showed Western poverty. In 1947, journalist Konstantin Simonov published his article The Lessons of Victory in Pravda. It addressed the problem directly. Some of our soldiers, confused by the material abundance they witnessed in Germany, have begun to question our achievements. They forget that German prosperity was built on the backs of enslaved peoples. They forget that capitalism creates luxury for the few and misery for the many. They forget that we are building a society where all people will live well, not just the exploiting classes. But the veterans remembered their own observations. They remembered that the exploited workers of capitalism had lived better than Soviet heroes. They remembered the bathrooms, the bicycles, the abundance of food. They remembered, and they could not forget. The Soviet government's solution was to minimize contact with the West. The Iron Curtain fell not just to keep Western influence out, but to keep Soviet citizens from seeing what veterans had seen. Foreign travel became nearly impossible. Western publications were banned. Contact with foreigners was criminalized. It was a 40-year campaign to make Soviet citizens forget what tens of thousands of soldiers had learned in 1945. The West had won the material struggle by a margin so vast it was almost incomprehensible. The forbidden letters somehow, despite everything, some letters survived, hidden in attics, buried in gardens, kept secret for decades. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, archives opened and families felt safe enough to share what their fathers and grandfathers had written. These letters tell the story the government tried to suppress. From Sergeant Ivan Kovalev to his wife, written May 1945, never sent. Darling Katya, I don't know how to tell you what I've seen. The Germany we were told was starving has shops full of food. The workers we came to liberate lived better than our generals. Every house has electricity. Every apartment has a bathroom. I entered a toy store with 3 floors of toys, just toys. I thought of our Petya playing with his wooden block and I wept. What have we been fighting for? I killed men to bring them our paradise, but they already had their own. And theirs was better. Katya, what will I tell Petya when he grows up and asks why we live the way we do? From Lieutenant Dmitry Medvedev to his brother, written June 1945, confiscated by censors. Sasha, you asked what Germany is like. I don't know how to answer without getting arrested. I'll say this, remember when we were children, and grandmother told us fairy tales about magical kingdoms where everyone had plenty to eat, and warm houses and beautiful clothes. I found that kingdom, Sasha. It's called capitalism, and we just destroyed it in the name of building something better. From Captain Boris Slutsky to his friend, written August 1945. Found in KGB archives in 1992, the Americans gave us a tour of their supply depot today. Yuri, I cannot describe it. Mountains of food, warehouses of clothing, entire buildings filled with equipment, and this was just supplies for their army in one sector. Their private laughed at my amazement. He said this was normal. He said America produces so much they don't know what to do with it all. I thought of our factories that can't produce enough boots for the army. I thought of our people standing in line for bread. I thought of our collective farms that can't feed themselves. And I understood. We didn't win because we were stronger. We won because there were more of us and we were willing to die in greater numbers. But that's not a victory I'm proud of anymore. The silent generation, the Soviet veterans of World War I, became known as the silent generation. They had seen too much. They knew too much. And they couldn't speak. But silence doesn't mean forgetting. They raised their children with subtle lessons. They taught them to question propaganda. They encouraged them to pursue education, to think critically. They passed on a skepticism that the party could never quite eradicate. When Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985, many noted that he was from this generation too young to have fought, but old enough to have been raised by fathers and uncles who had seen the West, who knew the truth. His reforms, glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring, were attempts to address the fundamental reality that Soviet veterans had discovered in 1945. The system wasn't working. It had never worked as well as capitalism, and continuing to pretend otherwise was destroying the country. In 1989, as the Berlin Wall fell, many elderly Soviet veterans watched on television. They saw East Germans flooding into West Berlin, amazed by the prosperity they found there. They saw the shops full of goods, the cars, the abundance. One veteran, watching the news, turned to his grandson and said simply, "We tried to tell them." The final accounting by the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, historians could finally begin documenting the full impact of what Soviet soldiers had witnessed in 1945. The numbers tell the story. Soldiers who witnessed Western prosperity. Approximately 6.5 million Soviet soldiers passed through Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. An estimated 1.8 million reached Berlin specifically, roughly 500. Zero had direct contact with American and British forces, at least 250. Zero spent months occupying Germany, witnessing everyday German life, the suppression campaign. Over 13,000 soldiers arrested for anti-Soviet agitation between 1945 to 1948, estimated 50. Zero subjected to re-education sessions, at least 1 million letters home were censored or confiscated, an unknown number simply disappeared. Long-term impact. Studies in post-Soviet Russia showed that children of veterans were statistically more likely to question Soviet propaganda. Veterans' families were overrepresented among dissidents in the 1970s and 1980s. Multiple Soviet reformers of the 1980s cited fathers or uncles who had seen the West, but the real impact cannot be measured in statistics. It was psychological, generational, cumulative. The Soviet Union spent 46 years trying to explain away what millions of soldiers had seen in a few months. They built the Iron Curtain to prevent others from seeing it. They created an elaborate propaganda apparatus to deny it. They imprisoned thousands for speaking about it, but they couldn't unsee it. The soldiers couldn't forget the bathrooms, the bicycles, the abundance of food. They couldn't forget that German workers had lived better than Soviet heroes. They couldn't forget that American mechanics owned cars while Soviet generals walked. And slowly, over decades, that knowledge corroded the system from within. The bicycle maker's son in 1995, 4 years after the Soviet collapse, a peculiar reunion took place in Berlin. 87 former Soviet soldiers gathered to tour the city they had conquered 50 years earlier. They were old men now, veterans of a vanished empire, survivors of a system that had tried to control their memories. One of them, former Sergeant Ivan Kovalev, asked to visit a specific neighborhood, the one where he had entered his first German house in 1945. His grandson accompanied him, filming the visit. The house still stood. Remarkably, the family still lived there. They had returned after the Soviet occupation ended in 1949. The family invited Kovalev inside. The old man walked through the room slowly, recognizing everything, remembering that day 50 years ago when his entire worldview had collapsed. The German homeowner asked what Kovalev was thinking. Through tears, the old veteran said, I stood in this kitchen in 1945 and understood that everything I had been told was a lie. I am 87 years old. The system I served is dead, but I wanted to come back here because this is where the truth began for me. This is where I started to understand that we had built our paradise on sand. The German man thought for a moment, then went to his garage. He returned with a bicycle, old, well-maintained, original to the house. This belonged to my father, the German said. The bicycle you saw in 1945. I want you to have it. Kovalev laughed through his tears. Now I don't need to steal it. They stood together in the kitchen, two old men who had been enemies, sharing a moment of understanding about the lies nations tell and the truths that cannot be hidden forever. The legacy, the story of Soviet soldiers discovering Western prosperity in 1945, is ultimately a story about the power of direct observation over propaganda. You can tell people that capitalism is failing. You can show them carefully selected photographs of Western poverty. You can teach them from childhood that their system is superior, but you cannot make them forget what they've seen with their own eyes. The Soviet soldiers who entered Germany in 1945 were true believers. They had sacrificed everything for their system. They were ready to die for communism. They expected to find validation for their suffering, proof that their hardships had been worthwhile, that their system was truly superior. Instead, they found bathrooms, bicycles, abundance, prosperity that exceeded their understanding, evidence that undermined everything they believed. And once you've seen that evidence, you cannot unsee it. You can be forced into silence, but you cannot be forced to forget. You can be prevented from speaking, but you cannot be prevented from knowing. The Soviet Union survived another 46 years after 1945, but the seeds of its destruction were planted in those months, when millions of soldiers saw the truth. Those seeds grew slowly, passed from fathers to sons, from veterans to students, from the silent to the curious. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, many factors contributed: economic stagnation, political corruption, nationalist movements, arms race exhaustion. But underlying all of it was a simple truth that millions had learned in 1945. The system didn't work. It had never worked as well as the alternative, and no amount of propaganda could change what people had seen. The story ends where it began, with a soldier entering a house and discovering the truth. Everything that came after the Cold War, the space race, the arms buildup, the eventual collapse, all of it was in some way a consequence of that simple moment of recognition. The Soviet soldier who saw German prosperity in 1945 became a walking contradiction, a man who knew something his society demanded he not know. He lived with that knowledge for the rest of his life, sometimes speaking it carefully to his children, sometimes keeping it locked inside, but always knowing. And in the end, the truth he carried was stronger than the lies he was told. Reality was more powerful than propaganda, and the bicycle in the German farmhouse was more devastating to Soviet communism than any number of American nuclear weapons. The veterans knew it. They had seen it, and eventually, their silence became louder than any speech, their memories more powerful than any propaganda. When the Soviet Union fell, those old soldiers understood what many others did not. It had been inevitable from the moment they stepped into that first German house and saw how the oppressed workers of capitalism actually lived. The war was won in 1945. But the long peace of the Cold War was lost the moment Soviet soldiers discovered that everything they'd been told was wrong. And you cannot build an empire on lies that millions of your citizens know are false. In the end, the truth didn't need to speak. It just needed to be seen. And it was.